There are roads truckers stop mentioning after a while. Not because they're dangerous, because eventually you realize everyone already knows. Nobody warns you directly. Dispatchers just get quiet. Older drivers suddenly change the subject. Truck stops near the route close earlier than they should. And if you've been hauling freight long enough, you start noticing patterns. Not supernatural ones, human ones. I used to run overnight freight through a mountain corridor in eastern Kentucky called Black Ridge Road. Officially, the route had a history of accidents. Unofficially, drivers disappeared there. Not many, just enough for people to remember. Their trucks were always recovered, cargo untouched, fuel untouched, driver's seat empty. No blood, no theft, no explanation. Most people blamed exhaustion, mountain roads, night driving, sleep deprivation. But older truckers used to say something strange whenever Black Ridge came up. They never said, "Don't drive there." They always said,
"Don't stop there after 1 in the morning."
At the time, I thought they were exaggerating. Now, I think they were trying to say something else. Something they didn't want spoken out loud. The night everything changed, I wasn't alone. Eric was riding with me. 24, confident, talkative, the logistics director's nephew. He wasn't training to become a driver, he just wanted to experience the real job. That should have annoyed me more than it did. We left Knoxville around 9 p.m. Rain started just after midnight. Not heavy rain, the kind that turns mountains into silhouettes and makes every gas station feel isolated. Eric kept joking about Black Ridge the entire drive.
So, where's the ghost woman everybody talks about?
Who told you that?
He shrugged.
People at the depot.
That bothered me immediately, because nobody at the depot ever openly talked about Black Ridge. Not around new people, especially not him. At 12:52 a.m., Eric pointed toward a dim light through the trees. A roadside diner. One gas pump, one flickering fluorescent sign. No visible cars. I'd driven Black Ridge for nearly a year. I had never seen that diner before. That should have been enough reason to keep driving, but I was exhausted. And strangely, the moment I saw the building, I felt relief. Like I'd been looking for it without realizing it. That feeling stayed with me the entire time we parked. Inside, the diner smelled like old coffee and wet carpet. Only one woman worked there, late 30s maybe, dark hair tied back, gray sweater sleeves damp from rainwater. She looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like someone who'd been waiting too long for something impossible. The strange part wasn't her appearance, it was Eric's reaction. The moment he saw her, he stopped talking, completely. Not fear, recognition. Like he knew her from somewhere but couldn't place it. The woman noticed too. She stared at him longer than necessary before speaking.
You've driven this road before, haven't you?
Eric frowned.
No. First time?
But he answered too quickly, almost defensively. The woman didn't argue. She simply nodded and poured coffee into 2 mugs. Then she asked,
"Have either of you heard the name Daniel Voss?"
I said no immediately. Eric didn't answer. He just kept staring at her. Then finally asked,
Why do you keep asking drivers that?
That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. Not what he asked, how he asked it. Like he already knew she asked everyone. The woman looked genuinely confused for the first time.
Because somebody has to remember them.
Them. not him. That detail wouldn't make sense until much later. The diner kept getting colder. Not outside, inside. The coffee stopped steaming within seconds. Condensation formed along the inside of the windows. Eric became quieter and quieter. Every few minutes he glanced toward the back hallway behind the kitchen, like he was hearing movement back there. Eventually, I asked him what was wrong.
What's wrong, man?
He hesitated before answering.
I think I've dreamed about this place before.
The woman froze when he said that. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Then she quietly asked,
Do you remember the river?
Eric looked disturbed immediately, like the question triggered something physical, a headache, a memory, a panic response. That was the first moment I considered leaving. We got back on the road at exactly 1:06 a.m. The woman followed us outside into the rain. Before closing the passenger door, she leaned closer to Eric.
If you start hearing children, do not answer them.
No explanation, no emotion, just exhaustion. About 15 minutes later, the truck engine died. No warning lights, no overheating, just silence. The truck rolled to a stop near a steep wooded drop beside the river valley. Rain hammered the windshield. Fog swallowed the headlights. Eric stared into the trees, then he...
There's someone down there.
At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed small lights moving between the trees. Not flashlights, too low to the ground, like reflections moving at child height. Eric slowly reached for the passenger door. I grabbed his arm instantly.
What are you doing?
He looked genuinely confused. Then I realized something horrifying. He wasn't trying to walk toward the road. He was trying to walk toward the river embankment, like someone had called him there. I restarted the truck. The engine came back immediately. Too easily. That disturbed me more than the breakdown itself. Eric stayed silent for almost an hour afterward. Not sleepy, disconnected. Like part of his attention was somewhere else. Like he'd been standing outside for hours. He kept staring ahead, listening.
You hear them now, too.
That sentence terrified me, because until that moment, I hadn't admitted to myself that I could hear anything. Very faint, almost hidden beneath the rain. Children laughing somewhere below the road. Not screaming, playing. The sound carried strangely through the fog, too distant to locate, too clear to ignore.
Why do they always end up near water?
I felt my stomach drop, because I had never told him where the missing drivers were found. And state police never released that information publicly.
How did you know?
I asked him how he knew that. Eric looked confused again, almost frightened. I don't know. And for the first time that night, I believed him. We reached the freight depot near sunrise. I expected daylight to make everything feel irrational again. Instead, things became worse. An older dock worker saw Eric climbing out of the truck and immediately went pale. Not fear, recognition. The old man stared at Eric for several seconds before speaking quietly to me.
You shouldn't have taken him through Black Ridge.
I asked what he meant. The dock worker hesitated too long before answering.
Some people hear it easier than others.
I asked,
Hear what?
but he walked away before I could stop him. Eric stopped coming to work 3 days later. At first, people said he was sick. Then people stopped mentioning him entirely. That silence bothered me more than his disappearance, because everybody at the depot seemed to silently agree not to discuss it, like this had happened before. I visited Eric's apartment 2 weeks later. His sister let me inside. The apartment was freezing, exactly like the diner. Eric barely slept anymore. When he did, he spoke in fragments, Names, road numbers, river locations. Always while half awake, his sister finally admitted something strange. A week before disappearing, Eric had started sketching the same image repeatedly. Children standing beside water, watching trucks pass at night.
I asked Eric directly what he remembered. For a long time, he said nothing.
I think she thought I was somebody else at first.
Then quietly answered, "Who?"
One of the drivers.
That changed everything. Not because it explained the phenomenon, because it changed the timeline. The woman wasn't randomly haunting drivers. She was searching. And somehow, Eric resembled someone connected to Black Ridge. That was when I started digging into the route's history. Old newspaper archives, missing persons reports, insurance claims, dispatch records. Eventually, a pattern emerged. Not supernatural, human. For nearly 20 years, children had disappeared along freight corridors running through the mountains. Runaways, foster kids, migrant children, children difficult to trace. And every few years, a driver disappeared too, usually after asking questions. Then I found the name again, Daniel Voss. Not a victim, a freight coordinator connected to multiple undocumented transport routes in the late 90s. No confirmed photograph, no confirmed death. Most records missing, several sealed investigations. And suddenly the entire story shifted. Black Ridge wasn't haunted because people died there. Black Ridge was contaminated by decades of hidden violence. Then I found the dashcam recording, recovered from a state trooper vehicle pulled from a river 13 years earlier. Corrupted footage, broken timestamps, audio distortion. But one section remained intact. A woman standing beside the road in heavy rain.
Ma'am, are you all right?
The officer approaches her, asks if she's injured.
Ma'am?
Have you seen any of them?
Not my son, them. The video glitches violently afterward. The trooper disappeared 3 days later. Same road, same river, same pattern. And that was the moment I finally understood something horrifying. The woman wasn't the source of Black Ridge. She was part of its memory. Like the road itself had absorbed decades of fear, guilt, and unfinished disappearance. People who carried enough guilt started hearing it, seeing it, responding to it.
I returned to Black Ridge one final time, alone. Heavy rain again, 1:07 a.m. And the diner was there waiting for me, exactly where it had been before. This time, I noticed something different immediately. There were photographs covering the wall behind the counter, dozens of them. Missing children, missing drivers. Most partially faded from moisture and age. Some faces scratched out completely. Not violently, carefully. Like someone had tried to erase them over time. The woman sat alone in the corner booth, exhausted, not threatening, just tired. I sat across from her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she slid one photograph toward me. A little boy standing beside a truck stop arcade machine. And behind him, barely visible in the reflection of the machine screen, stood the old dock worker from the freight depot, watching. That's when the final piece connected. The dock worker wasn't avoiding Black Ridge because he feared it. He feared being recognized by it. Some of the older drivers had known about the trafficking routes for years. Some participated, some ignored it, some tried to forget. And Black Ridge became something worse than a haunted road. It became a place where suppressed memory kept resurfacing.
I finally asked the woman who the child was. She looked at the photograph for a long time before answering.
The first one anybody stopped searching for.
Not her son. The beginning. The first child everyone collectively allowed themselves to forget. That's why the faces were scratched out. Not by ghosts, by time, by denial, by people trying to erase guilt. The diner itself suddenly made horrifying sense. It wasn't appearing randomly. People connected to Black Ridge noticed it because they were already carrying part of the story inside them. The road wasn't choosing victims, it was resurfacing memory. Then the diner lights shut off. Complete darkness. Outside, CB radios erupted simultaneously from the parked trucks beyond the windows. Dozens of overlapping bursts of static. Then one calm voice repeated across every channel.
Another truck just entered Black Ridge Road.
Not a warning, a notification. Like a system still operating. The fluorescent lights flickered back on. The woman was gone. Only the photographs remained. And outside, the parked truck drivers were all staring toward the diner windows. Completely motionless. Not supernatural. Worse. People. Some old, some exhausted, some ashamed. All pretending for years they didn't know what happened on Black Ridge. The CB radio crackled one final time.
People don't find Black Ridge by accident. Most of them already know why they came.
And somewhere beyond the rain, down near the unseen river below the mountain road, children were still laughing.
Every story has its price. Every place has its rules. If you want to make it out of the Clay City alive, you need to know what's coming next. Subscribe to Claymare Tales. Stay informed. Stay alive.